each other and we see ourselves in it. Welcome back. We hope you had a wonderful break. Danny, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We hope you had a nice breakfast or lunch or dinner if you're online, wherever you are in the world. We are going to hear right now from our first keynote speaker of the day. So everybody, make sure you are listening up, taking notes, because you definitely want to hear what Dr. Shawna Pandya has to say. Let me tell you a little bit about her today. Dr. Shawna Pandya is a physician, a scientist astronaut candidate with Project Possum, an aquanaut, a speaker, a martial artist, advanced diver, skydiver, pilot in training, a VP immersive medicine with Laxonic Technologies. She is the Director of Medical Research at the Orbital Assembly Construction and a Fellow of the Explorers Club. She is also Director of the International Institute of Astronautical Science, Space Medicine Group, a Chief Instructor of the IIAS Possum Operational Space Medicine course, a clinical lecturer at the University of Alberta, a podcast host with the World Extreme Medicine's Webcast series, primary investigator for the Shad Canada Blue Origin Student Microgravity Competition, a member of the Ascend 2021 Guiding Coalition, and a life sciences team lead for the Association of Spaceflight Professionals. She serves as a medical advisor to several space, medical, and technology companies. Dr. Pandya was part of the first crew to test a commercial spacesuit in zero gravity in 2015. Dr. Pandya earned her aquanaut designation during the 2019 Neptune, which was the Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration mission. She previously served as commander during a 2020 tour at the Mars Desert Research Station. In 2021, Dr. Pandya was granted an honorary fellowship in extreme and wilderness medicine by the World Extreme Medicine Organization and named one of the Women's Executive Network's top 100 most powerful women in Canada, as well as the Canadian Space Agency Space Ambassador. Her career and trajectory have been captured at the Ontario Space Centre's Canadian Women in Space exhibit alongside Dr. Roberta Bonta, the first Canadian woman in space, and who is Dr. Pandya's idol growing up. Wow, what a bio. Holy moly. We're
What
so
a
excited.
resume.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you here, Dr. Pandya.
And she's an IB former student.
Oh, and before I forget, she was an IB alumni. And of course, we had to have her here today. So welcome, Dr. Pandya. Let's give her a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Before we get started, thumbs up at the back if you can hear me okay. Can you hear me at the back? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about my trajectory, where I started. Once upon a time, like you, I was an IB student. But before we get into it, I want to give you a little glimpse into the world I live in as an explorer. So we're going to start with a video. So here we go. If we can get the volume on that, please.
Why do we explore? Why do we discover? I think discovery is a fundamental human trait. It's what makes us human. You could send astronauts up to hostile environments, to space or the moon or Mars, without knowing what to expect. Or you can try to prepare yourself as much as possible here on Earth. And the Mars Desert Research Station is one of these simulated environments. The bottom line is, space is trying to kill you. Coming up to the Mars Desert Research Station is like going through a portal into another world. You see these tremendous formations that look like they've been meticulously arranged by a giant. I would say that human exploration in space is one of the most challenging and one of the most ambitious things that we've done as a human race. When you look at your ideal candidate for Mars, you want your jack of all trades, but at least master of some. Taking part in centrifuge studies, experiencing aerobatic flight. I've been a lifelong martial artist. I'm a physician. I have a background in space medicine and space medicine research. Everything I do in my life is related to reaching that goal. I want to be the one that forges trails, the one that leads the way, the one that sets foot on Mars. Unless someone actively stops me, I will be here pushing limits forever. Now where do we go to next?
So that is a little glimpse into my world. Land Rover was kind enough to cover my work in exploration, and we're going to talk all about what it means to explore and what it means to push the limits and what it means to encounter both success and failure and learn from it, because I think a universal theme we all have in common is we've all encountered struggles in our lives. So as you've seen, I have a background in aquanautics, in spacesuit testing as a physician, and before I was any of that, I was a kid with a dream. And, oh, looks like the clicker is no longer working. Can we get to the next slide, please? There we go. So this was me when I was a kid. Even then, I was dreaming of the night sky and was impressed by airplanes. I would do a lot of camping as I grew up, and I just remember being dazzled by the night sky when I was out in the middle of nowhere, seeing that spiral arm of the Milky Way glittering and thinking, I want to be out there. And I'm Canadian, so I grew up during the 90s when the second ever Canadian astronaut selection took place. And then I learned that there were people who actually could go out and go to space and work in space as a living, and I realized that that's what I wanted to do. And I was also tremendously inspired by the first ever Canadian female astronaut in space, Dr. Roberta Bonder, and I looked at her trajectory. So I looked at her and I said, she's Canadian, I'm Canadian, she's female, I'm female, so now to be like her, I just need to follow her path and be a neuroscientist, physician, and astronaut. And it's simple as that, right? And so that's what actually spurred me and inspired me to become a physician and study neuroscience. And today, my life, as you've seen, tends to be a mix of exploration, medicine in extreme environments like in space. So as you've seen, I get to work with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. We do cool things like testing spacesuits in zero-G through parabolic flight. So some of you may have heard of this as a vomit comet. And this is when you fly in an airplane, you're flying in a parabola, just like when you get to the top of a roller coaster and your stomach lifts into your throat and you're weightless for a second. We do that in an airplane. So we're flying up and down, and when we're falling at the same rate as the airplane, we're weightless for a period of 20 seconds at a time. And that allows us to study science and technologies like new spacesuits. And I could keep telling you what that's like, but I would rather show you. So here's some snapshots from previous testing campaigns. You heard that I'm a martial artist. I flew my black belt in zero-G a few campaigns ago, and here's a snapshot of what that looks like. Oh, go back. Get that to play, please.
How are all the tasks
So I can tell you from experience that it is incredibly fun being in zero G and wearing a spacesuit. I highly recommend it. It's impossible not to be in that environment and not have a giant smile on your face. So if you ever have the opportunity to test a spacesuit in zero gravity, highly recommend it. My experiences with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences have also taken us to some pretty cool places to do some pretty unique science. So in northern Canada, we've been up in an unpressurized aircraft at 19,000 feet, so we need to wear those oxygen masks, and we're testing this new type of tomography instrument to get more information about noctilucent clouds, which are thought to be related to climate change. We've also, I've been able to take my expertise in medicine and develop my own space medicine course for my students. We've had everyone from doctors come to the course to high school students like yourselves who had an interest in aerospace medicine. And the idea is we teach them to be medical space MacGyvers, learning about assessment, triage, and treatment when you're in the middle of nowhere. You've heard that I also get to use my skill set to help companies develop cool technologies for austere and extreme environments. So I work with a virtual reality company called Luxonic Technologies, and you'll hear a little bit about how I got involved with that company a little bit later. But we get to develop medical procedures for everyone from astronauts to doctors to paramedics to learn medical skills in virtual reality. I also advise cool companies like Orbital Assembly Corporation. So this company is building the world's first artificial gravity space station, a space hotel, to be put in orbit by the end of this decade. So if you've ever seen the movie Space Odyssey 2001, you've seen that space station that's rotating, that can generate partial gravity, simple physics. The rate of rotation, as well as the radius of your space station, determines the amount of gravity you have. That's what we're building. And as you saw in the opening video, my work has taken me to some pretty extreme places like the Mars Desert Research Station. So it looks like Tatooine, but we call this real life on fake Mars. This is in the middle of the Utah desert in the United States. And you're living and working as a crew for 2 weeks at a time. I've been there as a crew medical officer as well as a commander. And you have to live and act as if you're living on Mars. So if you want to go outside, as you saw in the video, you have to suit up in a spacesuit, and otherwise the environment would kill you. I've also been lucky enough to pick up a few skill sets along the way. So I am an advanced diver, and I attained my Aquanaut mission on the Neptune mission in 2019, as you heard. So that stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. We'll talk a little bit more about that later this talk. And we lived and worked as a crew for 5 days, living in a habitat underwater. And we performed scientific experiments, technology demonstrations, and also talked to schools all across the world. I've been a martial artist. I've fought Muay Thai in Thailand. I won that fight. I've competed at the Worlds as a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, most recently in Hungary, Budapest at the World Championships. And I'm working on getting my pilot's license, and I'm a solo skydiver. So I've been around the block a little bit. And I've been lucky enough to share my story with really neat audiences all around the world, like yourselves. And this all came full circle when the woman who inspired it all, Dr. Roberta Bondar, as you heard in my introduction, I was lucky enough to have my work captured beside hers permanently at Canada's largest science center. But before all of this, I get asked a question very frequently, like, why space medicine? What is space medicine? How do you even study that? So for those of you who might be budding doctors or budding physiologists or scientists, I just want to take some time to explain to you what that is. And so if you know nothing else about space, it's simply that space is trying to kill you. And so when we talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment, a really obvious one, of course, is zero G. So every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. Our bones lose mass, our bones lose density, our muscles lose mass, the fluids shift upwards towards our head, there's more pressure on our brains, but that's not all. When we talk about sending astronauts to Mars and beyond, we have to worry about what we call the ridge framework. So increased radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth, altered gravity. So it's not just weightlessness in space. You're 17% as heavy as you would be on the moon, 38% as heavy as you would be on Mars, and hostile environments, which includes everything from exposure to lunar dust to altered day-night cycles. So when you're up on the International Space Station, you're experiencing 16 sunrise-sunset cycles every 24 hours. So that's one sunrise, one sunset every 90 minutes. And to give you an idea of how much the distance from Earth matters when you're sending astronauts to space, when you're sending astronauts to a place like Mars, depending on how the Earth and Mars are aligned, it can be up to 46 minutes between the time I say hello, an astronaut receives that and replies hello back. So this is why there's a field called space medicine. And if you take away anything from this part of the talk, it's simply that space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. So how do we prepare ourselves and astronauts for life in space? Here's a question for you. What do the International Space Station and a remote village in Kenya and a medical deployment in Antarctica and an underwater research habitat have in common? Well, the answer is that they're all resource limited and remote in some way. They all replicate the spaceflight environment in one way. So we say they're analogous to the spaceflight environment, so we call them analog environments. So one way in which we prepare humans for space is by sending them to analog environments on Earth. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we learn from extreme and analog environments on Earth through some of my own experiences in this next part of the talk. So we talked about what it means to be in an altered gravity analog by showing you what we do in parabolic flight. So that's just one example, because when you're flying in this plane in a parabola, you have 20 seconds of 0G, but maybe the 20 seconds isn't enough to test the science and the technology that you want to. So how do you generate a longer period of 0G? Another way is through altered gravity environments. So this is testing that we did with the Canadian Space Agency in 2019, and this is what we call a gravity offset harness. And so as you can imagine, you're in this harness and you're able to offload up to 99% of your weight, and you can simulate 0G. So in this scenario, I'm practicing fixing a module outside the International Space Station being practically weightless. Other ways, we can simulate different types of gravity are in centrifuges. So being in space isn't just about being weightless, it's about experiencing increased acceleration and increased G-loads with launch and landing. And that's where centrifuge studies come into play. And so you saw in the introductory video, myself in a centrifuge. So in this centrifuge studies, we were able to experience up to 6 Gs front to back. So if you can imagine, your chest wall is 6 times heavier and you have to struggle to breathe through that. And so that's the value of a centrifuge. We also learn a lot through water analogs. So a lot of my experiments and experiences have taken me to water testing scenarios. So in this particular scenario, we're testing how this spacesuit, called an IVA or intravehicular activity spacesuit, interacts with the capsule into the water, and we have to exit in an emergency fashion. You heard about the Aquanaut mission, in which we spent 5 days underwater in the Florida Keys. And so this was our team. We were a crew of 5, 2 Canadians, 3 Americans, and we spent 5 days underwater testing really cool technologies. And that's actually how I got involved with the virtual reality company, because we took this piece of medical virtual reality technology, and as a crew medical officer underwater, I was able to meet with the head of radiology in Canada over 4,600 kilometers away to review the simulated imaging of a trauma patient. We were also able to test this technology in 0G, and my travels also took me to another underwater research facility called NEMO. So if you know anything about space, you'll know about the NEMO facility, which was where NASA sends its astronauts to do underwater science and live as a crew for 8 to 16 days at a time. So this is in the same place as the Jules Undersea Lodge where we did our underwater mission. And you kind of feel like you are the fish in the fish tank as all these fish go swimming by your window, looking in at you. And it's a pretty special place. You're at 60 feet underwater when you're in the Aquarius Reef base where the NEMO missions are run. Learn a lot from isolated and confined environments. So you saw the Mars Desert Research Station earlier. And so to give you an idea of how vast this is, it really does look like Mars. There's just you and your crew for miles all around, so you really learn about teamwork, dynamics, and what it means to be a good team member. And finally, you don't need to go out to the middle of nowhere to have an analog environment. Sometimes you just take the resources out of your environment and you can create an analog environment. So when we do our operational space medicine course, we bring our students to the wilderness and then we take away their resources and say, well, this is what you have in terms of training and knowledge. How do you approach this medical situation? So I know a lot of you are just starting out on your careers. You're kind of on that path where you're nearing the end of your high school careers. You're figuring out where you want to go next, what you want to study next. What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? So the rest of my talk is going to focus on how I got from this little kid who wanted to be an astronaut to the journey I took and the lessons I learned along the way. So once upon a time, like you, I was an IB student. I did full IB. I had to write my extended essay. I was just remembering in the audience hearing about your experiences with the extended essay. I remember how painful it was, so you're not alone. And then I graduated, and like you heard earlier, I knew I wanted to pursue neuroscience because the woman who I admired and became Canada's first astronaut also studied neuroscience. So I went and studied neuroscience, had my sights set on medicine, knew I wanted to be a doctor, so that would be my path to space. And then I heard about this place called the International Space University. So this is a real place. It's a school in Strasbourg, France. This is where I did my master's in space sciences. But it wasn't always such a clear-cut path, because in my mind, I would go get my degree in neuroscience, go be a doctor, and then go pursue space. And I was accepted to both the master's program as well as the med school at the same year. And this was when I faced my first really tough but good, hard decision. Do I go to medical school, or do I go do this space thing? And then I realized that, you know, a lot of what I'm doing is driven by this passion for space, so why not do both? So I asked the medical school if I could defer my admission, and somehow they said yes, and that was the beginning of a whole new adventure in which I learned that you can make a career out of space. You can do things in space that you're passionate about, whether it's engineering, policy, law, or in my case, medicine. So these are all the women from my year. This was in Star City in Russia. We're standing outside a Soyuz space capsule. So the cool thing about going to school at a space school is that your field trips end up being to really neat places like Russia or like Belgium, where you can see satellites being made. And this was also the first time that I realized you could make space medicine a part of your career. And so I was lucky enough to intern at a place called the European Astronaut Center, which is a division of the European Space Agency, in their crew medical support office. And through my master's work, I was able to create a quick reference guide for a brand new delivery vehicle to the International Space Station. And this was just the start of it. I started seeing opportunities, started thinking of them, starting seeing how could I be involved with that, even if I wasn't yet qualified. And so this was the first step on a journey towards becoming involved in space medicine. And this is my second ever opportunity. So this was at NASA's Johnson Space Center. The gentleman in the red shirt is astronaut Kjell Lindgren. He just finished being commander of the ISS earlier this year. He's an aerospace physician. And the really important learning point here is I knew about this aerospace medicine elective at Johnson Space Center at NASA since I was in grade 12. I wanted to apply for it ever since I was at your stage, but it was only open to final year medical students. So I knew about this opportunity 10 years before I could even apply for it. But in my mind, that was 10 years to prepare and become a competitive candidate for something I knew I wanted to do. And from there, the opportunities kept coming. I would go to space conferences. I met cool people like Bill Nye the Science Guy. And then I graduated medical school. And I realized, even as I went on to initially study neurosurgery and become a brain and spine surgeon, that I wasn't really done with space, that space bug was still calling. And so I kept up my research. Based on some of my previous work, I was asked to author a book chapter as a medical student, and then I was asked to author 2 more book chapters related to psychology in spaceflight and reproduction in spaceflight. And from there, myself and one of my research groups created and published the first ever guidelines on commercial spaceflight for suborbital flight. So I had quite a journey. But the most important part of that, I think, is the lessons I learned on the way. So I want to spend the final part of my talk sharing with you 10 key lessons that I learned about success, failure, bouncing back from failure, having a strong support group, and also pushing the limits. So the first one is something I just talked about, that even when we think we start off on a journey and we want to go from point A to point B, how many of you here right now, hands up, know exactly what you want to do with your career, know what you want to do once you graduate? Just by a show of hands, put your hand up if you know what you want to do. Few of you. So what I learned is that even when we know what we want to do, what we know what our set career trajectory is, sometimes opportunities creep up that maybe we need to say yes to. So the first lesson I learned is, don't be afraid to stray from your planned path, because those opportunities may be the best opportunities for what it is you want to do. The second thing I want to share with you is about success, because it's so easy to think that the people we look up to just woke up like this. They set a plan, they set their minds to it, they worked hard, and then they woke up and boom, they were successful. They went from point A to point B, when in reality, success looks a little bit more like this. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 5 steps forward, 7 steps back, and maybe this is universal, because I know I certainly didn't go from point A to point B. So I want to spend some time now talking about success, because success isn't always pretty and success isn't always perfect. So I want to say this now. It is okay to fail. And that is so important that I want to say it again. It is okay to fail. And I know that you're IB students, you're thinking, okay, what is she talking about? I know what grade I need and nothing else is acceptable. I get that, because I was that student. But even when we're succeeding, there's a way to succeed better. And every time that we have a suboptimal outcome, we can also learn from that. So I would posit that if you're always winning, you're actually probably in the wrong league. You're not challenging yourself enough. And in fact, one of my friends, she's Canada's 7th female fighter pilot. And she said, if you've never failed, you're either lucky, lying, or Jesus himself. So it's important to realize that we all fail, but there's a way to fail. So coming back to this idea that success isn't always pretty, success isn't always perfect, I want to take you through one of my training scenarios through the spacesuit testing we were doing. So this is through our work with WAS, and this is a water emergency egress scenario on an off-nominal landing. So that's a fancy way of saying crash landing. So your spaceship is not ascending to space as planned. You have to abort the launch. You have to eject from the space station and from the space capsule. And in this case, you're parachuting into the ocean. You have to release yourself from the harness of the parachute. You have to pull the seals on your spacesuit so no water gets into your spacesuit. You have to pull up your visor, deploy your portable flotation devices, swim over to a raft, declare yourself safe. Simple, right? So in my scenario, as soon as I hit the water, things went sideways immediately. So this is what we were supposed to do. But immediately, the seals on my suit were not filling up, or were not fully pulled. And so my suit started taking on a lot of water. So by the time I got to the raft, my spacesuit was filled with me, as well as water up to my chest. So now not only did I have to pull up my own body weight, the weight of a spacesuit, but a spacesuit full of water into the raft. So I was 40% heavier than when I started, and what should have been a 2-minute scenario suddenly became a 10-minute monumental epic struggle, and every single millimeter was a fight to get to the top of this raft. And at the end of the day, my success looked a little bit like this. So to orientate you as to what's going on here, this orange blob of a human being, you can see on the screen, that looks like a goldfish, is me, and that black thing sticking up in the top left of the screen in your right is my foot. And so that's me face first into the raft, tangled up, and my foot sticking up. So that's what my success looked like that day. Success isn't always pretty. Success isn't always perfect. And when I deconstruct as to what got me through that scenario, it was actually resilience. So what is resilience? It is this idea that we can stick to things, mental fortitude, mental toughness, stick-to-itiveness. And there's actually research around resilience saying that we can cultivate ourselves to be more tough, more strong, more able to rebound from failures. And so it's not simply that you're born more resilient than I am or that you just have that trait, but we can actually break it down into core components. And so when we look at the research around resilience, it comes down to 5 key traits: breaking things down, positive self-talk, positive social support networks, mental rehearsal, and impulse control. So coming back to the scenario, every single one of those traits got me through that scenario that day. There was that mental rehearsal, pretending I was actually in the ocean, and to give up would mean essentially accepting death. There was that impulse control, resisting that urge to give up, even though my fingers were shaking and wanting to let go and just end the scenario. There was breaking things down. I wasn't simply focused on going from the bottom of that ladder to the top, because that may as well have been focusing on a 3-mile journey. I was focusing on the next millimeter of ground gained. There was that positive self-talk, telling myself that I had this. And finally, there was the support from my teammates. They may not have been there in the pool with me that day, but they were around the edge of the pool, telling me I had this, that the end was in sight. So sometimes resilience can help us succeed or help us win even during times of success, and help us optimize our chances of success. So let's talk about the flip side of success now. Let's talk about failure, because just as success isn't always pretty and success isn't always perfect, sometimes failure can be deceptively innocuous looking. And this is a perfect example of that. This is a snapshot from a zero-G campaign that we flew in 2017. And in this case, we were flying with a brand new spacesuit, brand new aircraft carrier, brand new airfield. So with so many unknowns, we wanted to set ourselves up for success. So the veteran flyers, the most experienced flyers, including myself, were asked to fly this campaign. Except that day when I started, something felt off. I felt queasy and just didn't feel right, but I didn't want to ruin anything, so I thought, just walk it off, ignore it. You have a single job to do. You have a spacesuit to test. And so we got 5 parabolas into a 30 parabola campaign when the test director took one look at me, noticed how ashen gray my face was, called a knock it off, aborted the rest of the parabolas, pulled me out of the spacesuit, and then 30 seconds later, I threw up. So I will spare you the mental image of what it's like to throw up in 0G, but suffice to say it's gross. And then when you're flying with your visor down in your helmet, if you throw up in 0G, it actually poses a choking risk. So it can actually become quite dangerous. I felt terrible. I had one job to do that day. We had lost 83% of our data because we lost all those parabolas. And I felt horribly guilty. I felt like I'd let my team down. As they would say, you had one job to do. You had to test a spacesuit. And I kept apologizing about it until the test director said, look, it happens. You have to stop apologizing. And I realized that there's a way to fail. You can be hard on yourself in a way that is destructive. Or when you fail and when things don't go right, you can be hard on yourself in a way that's productive. And anytime you have a suboptimal outcome, you can learn from it. And one of the tools that we use is learning the art of the debrief. So anytime we're in an operational scenario, whether I'm flying, or whether I'm skydiving, whether I'm diving, or in this case, flying 0G, we debrief. So in this scenario, you can see all of us gathered around the table. So this is from our microgravity ground school. We're in the war room, we're planning our campaign, and what we do is we gather as a group all around the table. We plan what we're going to do parabola by parabola. Then we break off into our teams. We do a rehearsal on the ground, making sure every team member knows their role. Then we do a dress rehearsal in the ground, in our spacesuits. Again, making sure we know what every single team member is doing at every time. Then we fly the parabolas, and then we come back as a big group and we share the lessons learned. And the point is to reinforce the patterns of performance of things that went well, so we can keep repeating those patterns of excellence, but also to dissect what didn't go so well, so that the next time that we encounter that scenario, we can perform better, we can troubleshoot, and we can also share those lessons learned with the rest of the team. So that's why we practice the art of the debrief. The other thing about failure is knowing the art of realizing that failure can be a beautiful teacher if we let it. And then the final lesson about failure is something that I've learned from martial arts. There's a sign in our dojang that says, fall down 7 times, get up 8. So remember that as long as you have a pulse, as long as you're still breathing, it's not over. There's that quote that says, success isn't final, failure is not fatal. It's the courage to go on that counts. So anytime you encounter what you perceive as a failure, not getting into the school you wanted, not having an interview go well, having a bad grade, remember, you can use that to reinforce your performance and make yourself better for the next time. So the next lesson I want to share is about realizing that success and failure can be 2 sides of the same coin. Because if success isn't always pretty and success isn't always perfect, we can learn from our successes that didn't go so well. And if failure can be deceptively innocuous looking, we can also learn from our failures. So they're part of a spectrum. They're all learning experiences. All right, so you're a pretty ambitious crew. You all have very big dreams of what it is you want to do and what it is you want to be. So you probably have some goals set for yourself. So the next lesson I want to share about is goal setting and how we get things accomplished. So I often get asked, how is it that you're flying planes and working in the emergency room, as well as speaking Spanish and Russian, as well as practicing martial arts and going into wilderness training? And the answer is relax. I'm not doing all of these things in the same 24-hour period. I'm not piloting a plane and then jumping out of it, skydiving into the ocean, diving out of the ocean and running into the emergency room just in time to deliver a baby. That's not how it works. It's like athletics. Even if you're a star athlete in high school and you play football and field hockey and lacrosse and badminton, you're not practicing all of those sports within the same 24-hour period. So there is a season for everything. There's a time to prioritize your goals. And one of the tools that I use to reinforce that is one that I've learned through piloting. And it's what I call maintaining a rate of scan. So who here drives a car? Hands up if you've ever driven a car. So it's the exact same principle as when you're driving a car. So when I'm piloting a plane, I'm looking out at the world around me, as well as my instrument panel, as well as my map. And I'm constantly scanning between these 3 things. And the idea is I want to see where am I in relation to where I started and what is my progress to get there. And just as when you're driving a car, you're constantly looking at the road ahead of you, your rear view mirror, as well as your instrument panel. And you want to see, again, what is happening in the world around you? Where did you start? Where are you going? And what is your rate of progress to get there? And goal setting is no different. So when I'm goal setting, I look at my immediate, short, intermediate term, and long-term goals and saying, what do I want to do today? Where do I want to be 10 years from now? And what is my progress to get there? So that's what I mean by maintaining a rate of scan. The 6th lesson I want to share with you is figuring out who it is we want to be. So sometimes we have to do that with intent. And this is a 20-second, maybe 30-second exercise that you can actually do right now as you're listening to this talk. And that is just taking the time to figure out what your values are. So figure out what is important to you. For me, it's freedom, exploration, discovery, curiosity, and having the control to do what I want when I want. So figure out what your values are, and then define who it is you want to be versus who it is you are now, and figure out what that gap is of who it is you want to be and how you'll close that gap, and figuring out how you will close that gap. And then part of it is also knowing, what is your code of conduct? What is so important to you that you must conduct yourself in this way at all times? Is it being disciplined? Is it being kind? Is it always behaving with integrity? It's just a 30-second exercise. And the most important part about taking the time to document this now is you can come back to it every few years and say, hey, am I on track? Am I still the person that I am? Or am I developing into the person that I want to be? The final thing I want to address is the imposter syndrome. So for those of you who don't know, this is just that feeling of being like, I'm not good enough to be here. I'm not smart enough to be here. You know, there must have been a mistake when they let me into this program or this school, because everyone else clearly knows what they're doing, and maybe they're just waiting to realize their mistake. Who's ever felt like that? Like they're not good enough to be there? Definitely I have, and I still feel it. And anytime I ask this question to any audience, everyone feels it. And so the secret is, we all secretly feel like we're not good enough, but clearly we are. So what if we turned that on its head and used it as a way to make ourselves better? Because even if we don't believe that we're good enough to be here, or we're not smart enough, there's two ways to get around that. First of all is to question that feeling, to dissect it and say, well, why do I feel like that? In med school, it's so common to feel like you're not smart enough because everyone around you is so smart. So then say, well, why do I not feel smart enough? Is it because I don't study enough? If the answer is no, then just ignore the feeling and move on. But if the answer is yes, then say, well, what is my fix to that? Read more. So then that's one way to address that. But the second way that I address the imposter syndrome is realizing it's an opportunity to grow into the role you want. Because there's so many times people will say, hey, can you do this position? And I'll say, I don't think I'm qualified enough to do that. But if someone somewhere believes that you're qualified enough to do that, then take that as an opportunity to develop the skills and the knowledge to become that person that you want to be. The other thing, developing things that are free. So here are the things that are free, regardless of whether you're a student, whether you're a professional, whether you're an athlete. Discipline, organization, and a work ethic. If you strive to be the hardest working person in the room, that's for free. If you strive to be the most disciplined person in the room, that is for free. If you take the time to organize yourself, because you will be surprised at how often you get to young adulthood and then adulthood and realize that not everyone else has learned that lesson. The other part of it is realizing that no person gets to be successful without an entire team of supportive people who helped get them to where they want to be. So no human, no man, no woman is an island. And so there's a picture of my mom here with me in this spacesuit because she's a huge supporter of everything I do. And so part of it is seeking out those permissive environments. I was able to do a lot of what I did in medical school and in space school because I had faculty that believed in the opportunities that I was pursuing and that would let me take time off from medical school. So surround yourself by permissive environments at school, at work, and with your family. Have people who are willing to walk through walls for you, who are willing to make things happen, but also be willing to do the same for them. Because if you are asking people to put their reputations on the line, to give you their maximum effort, then you better be willing to do the same for them in return. So who here has never been afraid of anything? Okay, no hands are going up. So I used to get asked often a lot, you know, what are you afraid of? And I used to think that I'm not really afraid of anything. Like, what are you talking about? Until I went skydiving. And I realized as I was hanging outside of the airplane, 14,000 feet above the ground, about to jump out of this plane for the first time, that I wasn't afraid of heights per se. I was afraid of jumping from heights. And that was a really interesting realization to come through when you're halfway out of the airplane and realizing you have a decision. You can either call it a day, you know, do the walk of shame back into the airplane saying, hey, I'm too afraid to do this, or you can work through that fear. And for me, it took repetition, rationalization, and also working through the best and worst case scenarios. So rationalization, I looked back at the airplane, I looked at all the smiling, happy faces of all the experienced skydivers back there, and spoiler alert, they'd made it, they'd survived, they actually wanted to do it again. It took repetition. It took skydiving over and over again. It wasn't like I jumped once and my my fear was magically cured, and it also took working through the best and worst case scenarios. So it took on my radio failing on my second ever jump and realizing that I didn't have my instructor to guide me as how to land, so I had to learn to land on my own pretty quickly. It took spinning out of control by not having the correct body position several jumps later, and then hyperextending my shoulder and having to land with an injured shoulder. It took knowing the preparation of how to deal with emergencies while skydiving. So we can overcome fear through rationalization, repetition, and preparation, but it takes work. So as our time here winds down and we get to our second last lesson, I want to talk to you about the importance of paying it forward. Because all of you, whether you realize it or not, are role models for someone else. You might think, hey, I'm just, still in grade school. Haven't even started on my career. But whether you realize it or not, someone wants to be like you. Someone wants to say, hey, I want to have the grades that they do, or I want to be as involved as him, or I want to be as much of a leader as she is. So someone somewhere looks up to you and views you as a role model. And so take the time to invest in the people who do look up to you. And this really hit home for me when I interned at NASA Johnson Center, because I got there my first day and the phone rang in my office, which was off campus, but I was really frazzled because I'd lost my passport, and as a Canadian national coming to NASA, I wasn't allowed onto NASA campus unless I had my passport. So the phone rang, I picked it up and I said, oh, you have to hold on, I have to find my passport. And then I realized that the person I'd put on hold on the other end of the line was none other than Canadian astronaut and International Space Station Commander Chris Hadfield. And I just put him on hold. And the point of this story is that he was a busy person. He was training to be commander of the International Space Station. It's not like he didn't have better things to do, but he would still take time from his astronaut training schedule to come spend time with myself and the other medical student, teaching us about space, teaching us about what it means to be an astronaut, taking us flying. The first time I ever flew a plane was with Commander Hadfield. And so this is why I say pay it forward, because people who are at the tops of their careers are taking time to invest in you. They want to see you succeed. We all want to see you succeed. And at the same time, you're becoming a role model for someone else. So pay it forward. The last lesson I want to share with you today is don't ever stop pushing the limits. So why does that matter? Why is it important to push the limits? For me, it's like materials stress testing. So if you're a budding engineer out there in the audience, you know what this is. We push materials to their breaking point, to their very limits, to know how much they can take. And I think that human character is the exact same. We push ourselves to the limits for two reasons. The first reason is to know where our limit is, so we know not to go that far in the future. We know that's the end of our comfort zone. Or maybe we want to know that's where our limit is so we can reinforce ourselves. We can reinforce the material in question. We can reinforce our character so we become stronger, tougher, more prepared for next time. And this all really fell into place for me when I was at the Mars Desert Research Station with my exploration buddy. We would pick the highest, steepest, most slippery slopes to climb. And when we did, it all fell into place. We pushed the limits and pushed ourselves to these highest peaks so we could see what comes next. The reason we push our limits is we would not know what paths lay to be discovered if we hadn't pushed that far. So today we've talked about a lot. We've talked about success, failure, taking the road less traveled, dealing with the tough stuff, surrounding ourselves with good people. We talked about fear and paying it forward and why it's important to push the limits. So I know that all of you are just starting out and that someday I'll be in the audience watching you up on the stage talking about your experiences and lessons learned. And it all starts with a single step. Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to take your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Shawna. It was so great to see your journey. I love the little photo of you when you were small. And to see you today and living all of your dreams out is just really inspiring for me as for all of the students. We have a few questions that have been sent through to us that we've got for you. So if you want, we can
Yes, of course.
take a seat. Take
Yeah.
a seat. You've been standing for a while now. And we're going to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Well, the first question that someone had, and I think you answered it, was, how is she able to do all of these jobs?
Yeah, so in my life, I like to say life is like a box of medical chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So every day for me is completely different. So I can be here in Mexico talking to you. I can be on Saturday and Sunday, I'll be in the emergency room. And then the other part of it is realizing that I'm not doing the same things in a 24-hour period. I'm prioritizing, okay, what needs to be done today versus what needs to be done next week versus what can wait. So a lot of it is prioritizing and figuring out what can wait versus what needs to be done.
Right, and I guess you have to just live in the moment, right? Like,
yeah, you know, sometimes it's like swinging through the jungle on vines. And one of the best examples I've heard of coping when you're in a busy program like the IB program, or if you're in training for medical residency, is sometimes if you're swinging through the jungle on the vine, you don't need to know about what the last vine is 10 vines down. You just need to know where your next vine is and where you're going to swing. So sometimes you can only have the bandwidth to focus on the next most important thing. You don't have to have the bird's eye view.
I have a related question. What do you do in your free time?
Oh, that's a great question. So what do I do in my free time?
If you have free time.
Yeah, I do. So for me, so that's a really important thing that we didn't get to in this talk, but that's the importance of recharging. And so, you know, I like to say that if if we compare ourselves to our smartphones, you know, if you're starting the day off at 3%, you're not going to be able to perform and get what you want done. So you have to take time to recharge, because you're going to perform a lot better for a lot longer if you're starting at 100%. So for me, the things I do to recharge are working out. I love working out. I love, if you follow me on social media, I love birds, so I have a lovebird. So spending time with her, and then spending time with friends and family.
I think that's important, like finding the life balance in between academic life, your professional life, your hobbies. I think that helps, you know, keep going.
Absolutely.
Which leads me on to my next question. Have you ever felt that sense of burnout, and how did you face that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say the most poignant example of that is during the pandemic, during COVID. So I'm an emergency room physician as well. And so last August, to give you an idea, full-time ER is considered 12 shifts a month. But because there was such a need and COVID was so rampant back home, I worked 28 days of 31 days in August in the ER. And it meant none of my other stuff with my research interests or my space medicine interests was getting done. And I said, at the end of that, I said, this is not sustainable. And so I said, you know what, I'm just taking 10 days off from clinical practice because I'm not going to be able to be a good physician if I keep doing this, and I'm not going to be able to contribute in the way I want. So sometimes, to your point, the skill set isn't saying yes, it's setting boundaries and saying no. And the reason is the why. Like, why I'm saying no, because I want to be able to contribute meaningfully in a way that I want, in a way that lets me stay recharged and not at 3%.
Yeah, I've heard someone say, like, what will you say no to? You know, to say a better yes. So I think that's a really good point there. Awesome.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience abroad, and they asking, how do you know if a goal is too high to achieve?
That's a great question. I'm smiling because I don't think any goal is too high. You know, if you want to say you want to be the first person on Mars, do it. If someone says you can't, then say watch me. If someone says, you know, how will you be the first person on Mars? Set your sights even further. Aim to be the first person on Europa or Enceladus, right? So there's no goal too high. The other part of that, though, is, you know, there's that old adage, like, without a plan, a goal without a plan is just a dream. So, you know, create a blueprint for yourself to get there, right? So create those short-term versus intermediate versus immediate versus long-term goals. And so that will set your path. But don't let anyone tell you that you can't do that. They don't know your journey. You know better than anyone else what you can or cannot achieve.
You know, that relates to my next question, which has to do with one of the lessons you taught us. How do you overcome the imposter syndrome?
How do I, you know, it's so funny because how do I overcome the imposter syndrome? I feel like I'm just getting started, and I feel like I have a lot more skills to develop. The people who I work with, my teammates, they're all incredible. They're, to give you an idea, one of my friends who lives here in Mexico City, he worked at NASA as a physician. He's an aeromedical physician. He's also a commercial pilot. He also has a family and a kid, and it's like, I was telling him, I was like, someday I hope I can be as cool as you. And he, right? It's like, it's surrounding yourself by really high achieving people and who also want to lift you up. So part of it is also realizing that you're never done learning or achieving and using that as a growth opportunity, but also having these people lift you up as well.
I love what you said about failure, productive failure. And what was interesting to me was how you talked about the art of the debrief. And with every project, successful or a failure, you have that debrief. What kind of questions do you ask? And can they be questions that we ask ourselves in projects that we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you a very relevant example, and I was telling you off stage, and you'll relate to this, Danielle, you're an English teacher, is when I was in English in high school, I prided myself on being a top-tier English student. My lowest essay scores were 95%, and when I was in grade 10, I was the first student my high school English teacher had given 100% on an essay on. So, I was riding high. I was feeling fantastic about my skills. I had that same English teacher for 2 years. And then I got to Lit 21, and this teacher did not like my writing style. And suddenly I went from 100% to 75s, and one day I got a 67. I was like, oh God, it's all over. My day is over. Like, my life is over. Med school, astronauts, forget it. And that's, I think, the first time I formally debriefed with myself. Part of it was kind of a confidence issue, realizing I'm overthinking every essay. So I took every essay that I'd done well on and said, these are the points I want to reinforce. And then I took that horrid essay that still fills me with shame, and I said, okay, this is what can be made better. And then I slowly, it wasn't like the next one I suddenly aced it, got a 100%, but the mark was 20% higher, and said, okay, this is how I start building up. So even on your English essays, you can debrief, I promise.
I like that. I think even from the smallest things, you're able to ask yourself questions, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other part of that is realizing that sometimes failure is subjective, because probably if I look back at that essay now, it probably still was a good essay. Like, it's hard to imagine that you go from writing very well to not writing well at all in a matter of weeks. So maybe someone else perceives that you're not performing up to their standards, but I think that's also a way of stepping back and saying, when I look at my own standards for myself, did I perform up to my own standards? Because at the end of the day, you're the one who's in your head 24/7. You're the one you have to answer to, regardless of the outside critics.
That's awesome. And I think one last important question for our IB students. How did the IB program launch your life as a as a neuroscientist, astronaut, to be?
Yeah, I would say the work ethic. I said in the talk, a work ethic is free, and just aiming to be the hardest working person is so critical. And when you're doing full IB, you're doing all these extracurricular activities. There's very little time for anything else. And also developing that network. So there's a very, very core group of full IB folks at the high school I went to. And to give you guys an idea of how much IB was part of that high school identity, for my 17th birthday, my friends got me a t-shirt that said IB Princess. Like, I don't know if I should admit that.
I want to see that t-shirt.
So definitely the work ethic, and just realizing that, yeah, there's hard problems, there's heavy schedules, but it's manageable, and then also having that friends support is critical.
That community all around you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. No more questions from me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandya, for being here today. Absolute pleasure for us to have you here. Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick 15-minute break. So have a stretch, get up, get a drink of water, and we'll be back here with Sarah Tan and her amazing talk. See you soon.